For 4 decades, one woman constructed something the broadcasting industry largely believed was impossible. She didn't receive it as an inheritance or have it handed to her. She built it herself, starting with a single station in Dallas and eventually growing it into a signal that reached more than 100 million households and over 200 countries. A network that entered people's homes not as a form of entertainment but as a steady, faithful voice still present at 3 in the morning when everything else had fallen silent. There is a community of devoted viewers, millions of them, many elderly, many living alone, who didn't simply tune in to this network. They financed it. They sent letters. They gave from their limited, fixed incomes during fundraising drives because they sincerely and wholeheartedly believed they were supporting something that was genuinely meaningful. When the woman who created it passed away in May of 2026, without explanation, without warning, they expected to mourn together. What they received instead ignited one of the most heated controversies American evangelical Christianity had seen in years. Because the decision made in her name, without her voice, and apparently without any regard for the millions who had made everything possible, tied her final farewell to an institution whose founder had stepped down in documented disgrace following criminal allegations that he had sexually abused a child, a girl who was just 12 years old when it began. How did she build what she built? Who were the people who placed their trust in her for decades? And what did that trust truly cost them? Who made this decision and why? Before any of those questions can be answered, we have to go back to the beginning, to understand why her death shook millions, and why the controversy that followed cut so deeply into so many lives. To grasp any of it, you first have to understand what Joni Lamb actually created. And more than that, you have to understand who she was before the cameras found her, before the network existed, before the name Daystar meant anything to anyone. Because this was not a woman who came into power through privilege. She earned it one step at a time, one prayer at a time, one decade at a time, the way that only people who begin with very little ever truly learn to build. Joni Lamb was born Joni Davis in 1960 in a small town in South Carolina. She grew up in a household of modest means and a deep, unperformative faith, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly on Sunday mornings and disappear by Monday afternoon, the kind that quietly shapes how a family shares meals, how they treat strangers, how they absorb hardship without letting it drain them of their spirit. Church was not an obligation in the Davis household. It was the lens through which everything else in life was interpreted and understood. From an early age, Joni felt drawn toward a purpose she couldn't yet define. It wasn't ambition in the traditional sense, not a hunger for recognition or influence, but something quieter and more persistent than either of those things. In interviews throughout her life, she described it as a calling she was unable to ignore, a deep sense that she was meant to connect with people, to speak to something in them that ordinary life didn't always reach. She carried that conviction with her into adulthood, not yet knowing exactly what shape it would take. The answer came in the 1980s in the form of Marcus Lamb. Marcus was a young man in broadcasting with a vision that most sensible people would have dismissed without a second thought. He wanted to build a Christian television network, not a local access channel, not a regional station with limited reach and modest goals, but a national network, one capable of carrying a message of faith into homes across America. Every demographic, every time zone, every living room where someone sat alone at midnight wondering whether anyone was listening. The television industry in the 1980s was not a welcoming environment for that kind of idealism. The infrastructure needed was massive. The financial obstacles were real. The doubters were numerous and not entirely wrong. Marcus looked past all of it. And so did Joni. They married in 1987, and from that day forward they operated not as a minister and his supportive wife, but as true co-founders, equal in vision, equal in commitment, equal in the daily unglamorous, relentless work of turning an impossible idea into something that actually existed in the world. That distinction mattered enormously, both to the people who worked alongside them and to the audience that eventually found them. Joni was never in the background. She was never there for decoration. She was a builder. Everyone who spent time inside Daystar understood that from the very beginning. They launched Daystar Television Network in 1997. What started as a single station in Dallas, Texas, expanded with a speed that caught even its founders off guard. Within a decade, Daystar had become the second largest Christian television network in the United States. Its reach extended to more than 100 million homes domestically, and its international signal stretched across more than 200 countries, broadcasting sermons, worship music, teaching, personal testimony, and prayer coverage around the clock, every day of the year. The scale was remarkable. But scale was never what Joni talked about when she described what the network meant to her. What she talked about were the letters, thousands of them, from viewers who wrote in longhand on notebook paper or typed carefully on computers they had only recently learned to use, describing moments when they had switched on Daystar in the middle of a sleepless night, grieving, frightened, lost, and found something that steadied them until morning. A widow in rural Ohio who said the network was the only voice left in her house after her husband of 50 years died. A man in his 70s in rural Mississippi who had stopped going outside but still felt connected to something larger through the television screen in his living room. A mother in California who said she had found her way back to faith through a conversation she had watched on Joni's program. Not a sermon, not a performance, just an honest exchange between people willing to speak about the parts of life that polished religious broadcasting usually sidestepped. Those letters were the measure Joni came back to constantly. Not the ratings, not the donor figures, the letters. Her own program, Joni Table Talk, ran for years and became one of the most distinctive offerings in all of Christian broadcasting. The format was deceptively straightforward. A round table, a host, guests drawn from ministry, from entertainment, from everyday life, and conversation that followed wherever it needed to go. What made it work, what made it genuinely different from the dozens of similar programs that filled Christian television, was Joni's readiness to go where other hosts wouldn't. She asked about doubt, about failure, about the specific ways faith gets put to the test by real life and doesn't always come out looking the way you expected. She had no interest in projecting a certainty she didn't actually feel. Her audience recognized that immediately and rewarded it with a loyalty that lasted for decades. Then came November of 2021. Marcus Lamb died from complications related to COVID-19. He was 64 years old. The death came quickly enough that the public announcement landed like a shock, even for those who had been aware he was ill. For the Daystar audience, it was a moment of shared grief that the network's own programming had to carry in real time. Joni did not pull back from that grief. She did not grieve quietly in private. While the network carried on, she stepped forward publicly and deliberately, assumed full leadership of everything Marcus had built alongside her, and kept broadcasting. Those who worked with her during that season described a woman clearly bearing an enormous weight, and carrying it without allowing it to crush the mission. She spoke openly on air about loneliness, about the particular silence of a house that had always held two voices, about what it meant to keep answering a calling when the person you had built it with was no longer there. Her audience didn't drift away during that time. They drew closer because she was doing what she had always done. She was being honest. She was showing up. She was trusting that the people watching were strong enough to handle the truth, and that truth, even when it was painful, was more sustaining than comfort that wasn't real. For 4 more years after Marcus died, Joni Lamb led Daystar alone. And then, in May of 2026, she was gone, 65 years old. No explanation was offered. No clarity was extended to the audience that had trusted her with so much for so long. Only silence. And then something that made that silence far more difficult to endure. Grief within a faith community follows a particular rhythm. There is shock, then mourning, then the slow and painful process of gathering, in person, in prayer, in shared memory, to honor the one who has been lost, to speak her name in the presence of others who also loved her, to sit together with the weight of the loss, because some losses are simply too large to carry alone. That rhythm is sacred, and for the millions who loved Joni Lamb, they expected it to be honored. They expected a farewell that reflected what she had stood for, what she had built, what she had sacrificed. They expected, at a minimum, to be considered. They were not. The announcement came without fanfare, quietly, almost procedurally, as though the decision were self-evident and needed no explanation. Joni Lamb's memorial service would be held in association with Gateway Church, one of the largest megachurches in Texas, headquartered in Southlake, a wealthy suburb between Dallas and Fort Worth. On the surface, the connection made a certain kind of institutional sense. Gateway was large, well-resourced, and geographically close to Daystar's operations. It had hosted major evangelical events for years. It had the facilities, the auditorium capacity, the broadcast infrastructure, and the operational staff to manage a large-scale service. On paper. But the people who received that announcement were not reading it in a vacuum. They were reading it as members of a faith community that had been paying careful attention to American evangelical Christianity for years. And within that community, the name Gateway Church no longer carried the neutral institutional weight it once might have. By May of 2026, Gateway Church meant something specific, something that no logistical justification could erase. To understand the full impact of that reaction, you have to go back to the summer of 2024. That was when Cindy Cleeliser came forward. She did so publicly, deliberately, and with a level of specificity that made her account impossible to dismiss as vague accusation or misremembered grievance. She alleged that Robert Morris, the founder and senior pastor of Gateway Church, one of the most celebrated figures in American evangelical Christianity, author of more than a dozen widely read books on faith and financial stewardship, a man whose influence crossed denominational lines and whose endorsements carried real weight in ministry circles, had sexually abused her starting when she was 12 years old. 12 years old. Morris, according to her account, had entered her family's life as a trusted figure, a spiritual mentor, a family friend whose presence carried the authority and the safety that the word pastor is supposed to guarantee, especially to a child. The abuse she described was not ambiguous. It was not a matter of blurred lines or poor judgment in the complexities of adult relationships. It was the deliberate, repeated sexual abuse of a minor by a man who held absolute spiritual authority over her family. A man who knew exactly what he was doing and who understood precisely how the structures of trust, faith, and pastoral deference would make it difficult for a child, and later a woman, to be believed. She had carried that weight for decades. When she finally spoke, the evangelical world listened. And she was not alone. In the weeks following Cindy Cleeliser's public statement, additional voices emerged, women with their own accounts, their own memories, their own decades of silence finally given permission to end. The pattern that took shape across these accounts was not the portrait of isolated incidents or individual lapses in judgment. It was the portrait of a man who had used the structures of ministry, the access granted by pastoral relationships, the deference accorded to spiritual authority, and the silence enforced by a culture of institutional protection to carry out abuse over an extended period of time. Journalists and investigators began examining the institutional record. Questions arose not only about Morris's conduct, but about what those around him had known, when they had known it, and what decisions had been made in response. Those questions did not yield clean answers. What they produced was a picture of an institution that had for years placed its own continuity and reputation above the safety and dignity of the people it claimed to serve. That picture was damning. And it was documented. Robert Morris did not fight the allegations publicly. In June of 2024, he resigned from Gateway Church. The resignation statement he issued was carefully worded, clearly the product of extensive legal and communications consultation. It acknowledged, in language chosen with visible precision, that he had behaved in ways that were, in his own words, inappropriate with a young lady. A young lady, not a child, not a 12-year-old girl, not a minor placed in his care by a family who had entrusted him with something sacred and irreplaceable. A young lady. The reaction to that phrasing was immediate and fierce. Survivors, advocates, abuse prevention organizations, and ordinary believers across the theological spectrum immediately recognized what the language was designed to accomplish. It was constructed to concede just enough to preempt outright denial while minimizing just enough to limit legal and reputational damage. On a moral level, it failed completely, because the documented facts were not ambiguous, and the community of faith that had trusted Robert Morris, bought his books, attended his conferences, donated to his church, and sent their children to his ministry programs felt the full weight of what those facts meant. Law enforcement became involved. Investigations were opened. The story did not fade into the background noise of institutional scandal the way powerful organizations sometimes manage to make things fade. It stayed. It spread. It became, in the words of multiple observers across the evangelical press, the defining moral crisis of American megachurch Christianity in the decade. Gateway Church, the institution Morris had built over 30 years into a congregation of more than 100,000 members, continued to operate after his resignation. The remaining leadership issued a series of public statements expressing sorrow, commitment to accountability, and dedication to the healing of those who had been harmed. They announced internal reviews. They brought in outside consultants. They used the language of institutional repentance with what appeared to be genuine sincerity. But they did not change the name. They did not dissolve the institution and rebuild it under new leadership with a clean break from what had occurred. They moved forward as Gateway Church, carrying that name, and everything now permanently attached to it, into whatever came next. That was their choice to make. Institutions make decisions about their own survival and identity, and those decisions carry consequences. One of those consequences arrived in May of 2026, when the decision was made to hold Joni Lamb's memorial in association with an institution still operating under that name, still carrying that history, still defined in the collective consciousness of the evangelical world by the most serious moral failure imaginable. The association was not neutral. It was not simply logistical. It was a statement, whether intended as one or not. The response from Daystar's audience was not the kind of performative outrage that social media generates quickly and forgets just as quickly. It was something quieter, heavier, more deliberate, and in many ways far more consequential. In the Facebook groups and online communities where Daystar viewers had gathered for years, sharing prayer requests, testimonies, encouragement, and the ordinary texture of lives lived in shared faith, the tone shifted within hours of the announcement. Long-time donors began to write, not in anger exactly, in something closer to sorrow deepened by disbelief. Men and women who had given to Daystar for 20, 25, 30 years, who had called in during pledge drives, stretched their fixed incomes to contribute, felt through all those years that their relationship with the network was built on something more meaningful than a transaction. Began asking, publicly and without apology, how the decision had been made, who had been consulted, and what it communicated about the values of the institution now entrusted with Joni Lamb's name and legacy. The questions were not rhetorical. They were the genuine inquiries of people who had invested deeply, financially, emotionally, spiritually, and who felt, by virtue of that investment, that they were owed an accounting that was not being provided. What grew organically from those conversations was something participants themselves began calling a silent boycott. No single organizer, no coordinated campaign, no hashtag engineered by a communications team. Just individual believers, in their own words, on their own pages, making their own choices and then sharing those choices with the communities they had nurtured through years of digital fellowship. They would not attend the memorial in person. They would not watch the broadcast. They would redirect donations previously given to Daystar toward other ministries, organizations whose institutional associations did not carry the weight of what Gateway now carried. The word that appeared most consistently across hundreds of individual posts, written by people who didn't know one another and had not coordinated their language, was not outrage. It was grief. Grief layered upon grief. The loss of Joni herself, still raw and unexplained. And now the loss of something else, the uncomplicated trust her audience had extended to the institution she built. The confidence that the people now in charge of her legacy shared the values she had spent a lifetime embodying. One viewer, a woman who described herself as having watched Daystar since the network's early days, wrote something that circulated widely across multiple platforms. She wrote, "Joni always said the truth was worth telling, even when it was hard. I wonder what she would say about this." Nobody who read it had a clean answer. For those outside the evangelical world, the depth of this reaction may require some context. Within communities of deep faith, institutional association carries moral meaning that secular culture does not always attach to it. Fellowship is not a neutral act. When a Christian institution chooses to formally partner with another institution, particularly for something as sacred as the memorial service of a beloved leader, it is understood within that community as an endorsement, a declaration of alignment, a statement of shared identity, however unintentional in its framing. To hold Joni Lamb's farewell in association with Gateway Church was not, to the people who loved her most and longest, a matter of venue logistics. It was a theological statement, and in their judgment it was the wrong one. What made the wound cut even deeper was the financial reality that every longtime Daystar viewer understood intimately. The world of American megachurch Christianity does not operate in isolation. It operates within a dense web of institutional relationships, overlapping donor bases, shared board members, mutual endorsements, cross-platform appearances, and financial entanglements that are rarely visible to the ordinary believer sitting at home watching a pledge drive. These relationships shape decisions. They always have. Beneath the surface of the silent boycott lay an accusation its participants were too measured to state directly, but too honest to leave entirely unspoken, that the decision to associate Joni Lamb's memorial with Gateway Church had been made not in service of her legacy, but in service of the institutional relationships, the financial alliances, and the structures of evangelical power that had always operated invisibly in the background, and that in the world of Christian broadcasting, as in every world built on money and influence, the ties between powerful institutions speak louder than the grief of the ordinary believers who made those institutions possible. That the people who had given the most in faith, in loyalty, in decades of faithful financial support, were ultimately the last ones whose voices were considered. This was not a conspiracy theory assembled from nothing. It was a conclusion drawn from a single, documented, undeniable, publicly announced fact. The choice had been made, and the people it affected most had never been asked. There is a particular kind of grief that has no clean name. It is not simply sadness. It is not simply anger. It is not the sharp, clarifying pain of a loss you saw coming and had time to prepare for. It is something more layered, the feeling that arrives when something you built your trust around, something that anchored your mornings and steadied your faith through the hardest seasons of your life, turns out to be more fragile, more compromised, and more entangled in the ordinary machinery of human ambition than you had allowed yourself to believe. That is what thousands of Daystar viewers are carrying right now. Not a rejection of Joni Lamb, never that. A reckoning with everything that surrounds her memory. Because here is what the documented record shows. Not speculation. Not the noise of social media grievance. Not the predictable reflexes of people searching for something to be angry about. Fact. Joni Lamb spent 4 decades building a network whose stated mission was to carry hope, healing, and the presence of faith into the homes of ordinary Americans. She did that faithfully, consistently, and at genuine personal cost. She did it through the loss of her husband, through the relentless demands of running a media operation that broadcast around the clock across more than 200 countries, through the specific and exhausting burden of being a public figure of faith in an era when every decision made by religious broadcasters is scrutinized by people watching for exactly the kind of failure that faith is supposed to prevent. She earned the trust of her audience the hard way, one broadcast at a time, one honest conversation at a time, one moment of genuine vulnerability extended across a television screen to a stranger sitting alone somewhere in rural America at the moment that stranger needed it most. That trust was not manufactured. It was not the product of marketing strategy or carefully managed public relations. It was built over decades of showing up, of telling the truth, of treating the people on the other side of the camera as full human beings capable of handling reality. It was real. And what is equally real, equally documented, equally undeniable, is that the institution now entrusted with her legacy made a specific, deliberate, publicly announced decision to connect her final farewell to a church whose founder resigned in documented disgrace following criminal allegations of child sexual abuse. No institutional statement softens that fact. No explanation grounded in logistics, in long-standing relationships, in the practical realities of organizing a large-scale memorial service on short notice changes what that choice communicated to the people who loved her most. It communicated that their grief was not the primary consideration. It communicated that the relationships between powerful institutions, the alliances of influence and finance that operate in the background of evangelical Christianity, invisible to ordinary believers but consequential to the organizations those believers support, had been given more weight than the feelings of the audience that made everything possible. Whether that was the intent or not, it was the message received. And in the world of faith, as in every other world, the message received is the one that matters. The silent boycott that spread through Daystar's audience in the days following the announcement was not, at its core, an act of hostility. It was an act of faithfulness. Faithfulness to a standard that Joni Lamb herself had modeled for 40 years. The standard that says truth matters. that integrity is not a performance reserved for the cameras, that the values you proclaim in public must be reflected in the decisions you make in private, that the people who entrust you with their faith, their loyalty, and their resources deserve to be treated as partners, not as an audience to be managed. The viewers who turned away were not abandoning Joni's legacy. They were defending it. They were insisting, in the only language available to people without institutional power, that her name deserved better than the association it had been given, that her decades of faithfulness deserved a farewell untouched by the shadow of what Gateway Church had become in the consciousness of the evangelical world. They were saying, without drama, without a press release, that they had not given 30 years of their loyalty and their money to an institution so that it could make this kind of choice in her name. It was a quiet statement, but it was not a small one. What this moment reveals about the broader landscape of American evangelical broadcasting is something that, uncomfortable as it is, deserves to be named plainly. The institutions of Christian media, the networks, the megachurches, the conference circuits, the publishing houses, the donor ecosystems that connect them all, do not operate outside the logic of institutional self-interest. They are human organizations built by human beings, sustained by human relationships, and subject to all the pressures and temptations that human organizations have always faced. The faith they proclaim is genuine for many of the individuals within them. The institutions themselves are not immune to the corrupting pull of power, money, and the drive for self-preservation. What happened in the days following Joni Lamb's death was not an anomaly. It was a window, a moment when the background logic of institutional evangelical Christianity became briefly, uncomfortably visible to the people who fund it, watch it, and pray for it every day. Those people saw something they cannot unsee. And the question that now faces Daystar, the question that will determine whether the network Joni Lamb built can sustain the trust she spent 40 years earning, is whether the institution is capable of seeing it too. What happens to Daystar now is genuinely uncertain. The network continues to broadcast. The signal still reaches more than 100 million homes. The programming goes on. The mission, as stated, remains unchanged. But audiences are not passive recipients of broadcast signals. They are communities of people who make active choices about where to place their attention, their loyalty, and their financial support. And communities that feel their trust has been violated do not simply reset to their baseline once enough time has passed. They watch differently. They give differently. They extend the next measure of trust more carefully, more conditionally, and with a longer memory than the institution on the other side of the screen may fully appreciate. The viewers who stepped back from Daystar in the wake of this decision are not gone forever, necessarily, but they will not return automatically. They will measure every decision made by the leadership now steering the network against the standard Joni Lamb embodied for 4 decades. They will watch to see whether the institution she built is capable of the same honesty she modeled, the same accountability, the same willingness to put faithfulness above convenience. That is not a threat. It is simply the nature of an audience that was never passive to begin with. Joni Lamb was not a perfect person. No person is. But the documented, verifiable 40-year record of what she built and how she built it is one of genuine devotion, remarkable resilience, and a faith that did not perform itself for the cameras but lived itself out in the daily choices of a woman who believed the truth was always worth telling. That record belongs to the people who watched her. It belongs to the widow in Ohio who found comfort in her voice during the darkest nights of her grief. To the man who felt connected to something greater through a screen in a quiet house. To the mother who found her way back to faith through a conversation she watched on a Tuesday morning when nobody was putting on a show for anybody. It belongs to the audience, not to the institutions that now speak in her name. Joni Lamb deserved a farewell worthy of everything she gave. Whether she received one is a question each viewer must answer for themselves. What is not a question, what the documented record makes entirely clear, is that she gave more than most, that she built something real, that she was trusted by millions for reasons that were earned and not manufactured, and that the people who trusted her are still here, still watching, still faithful to a standard she spent a lifetime setting. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the difference between faith and the organizations that claim to represent it, between the devotion of ordinary believers and the decisions of institutional power, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories told without filters, without spin, and without apology. Because the truth, as Joni herself always believed, is always worth telling. Even when it is hard. Especially then.